specializing in the design of shipping container farms. Hey, Gabriel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, it's a pleasure.
And lastly, but never least, we have Juan Gabriel Sacar, the CEO and co-founder at Verde Compacto, an ag tech startup promoting a new era of agriculture that is focused on food security and promoting the production and accessibility of healthy food around the world. They recently also named one of the top 20 companies that are saving the planet. Congrats on that, Juan, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Erica, and your team for inviting us, and it will be a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be back. I think the last one I hosted was a few months ago, so it's nice to be back chatting with all of you. And I really do think that today, while we did Cultivated recently released an article on container farming in challenging climates. I believe we'll be linking that for our audience in the webinar here if you're interested and want to download that. And we will touch on a bit of the components of that article, but really what I want us to do today is talk about container farming in a more holistic sense, talking about the challenges, the benefits, the use cases that go into container farming to give our audience, a real value add and understanding of what container farming is and whether it's for them or not. So I think a great place to start is with you, Caleb, and going into some of those use cases that I had mentioned. Based on your market experience, what would you say is the most common use case for container farming?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, Erica. One thing that we found, before I get into specifics, with container farms is that the use cases are usually defined by the constraints of container farms. They're small in scale, typically. The container is usually only so big, and they have a one-to-one relationship to their product, meaning I can't, even if I add additional containers to a location or to a site, I still have a relationship between each individual container and its production capacity. So we have a burden on unit economics because of those two constraints, small in scale and modular, meaning that I can't escape the container and be bigger than the container without losing the container itself, which means that I usually have a local impact, and it's usually on premium goods because I need to balance my unit economics of producing a container and then balancing the value of that container over time. The value over time comes from whatever I'm producing inside the container. And because of that unit economic relationship between small volume and the production cost, container farms have usually been focused on premium products, high-end mushrooms, high-end lettuce or leafy vegetables, stemmed vegetables, strawberries, more of the premium goods that can command enough dollars to offset the cost of production and a small volume from a scale perspective. So as I mentioned, typically, container farms have been looking at how do we solve those problems because they do have to pay for themselves in the end. We're finding, though, through advancements in technology, both from the technology inside the container farm and the technology from groups like Gabe and Juan's organizations around manufacturing of the containers, that we can start to expand now some of the use cases for container farms. For example, we focus on using and leveraging container farm technology to deliver a premium livestock feed on farm for livestock producers. But we're also seeing other organizations come out with novel applications of container farms in novel environments. And I think that's really compelling. I think a lot of that goes back to Gabe and Juan organizations, the work they're doing on reducing cost to manufacture container farms and service and maintain those. And also there's technological advancements inside the container. For example, in our container, we have 11 different levels. And so it's not just the size of the container itself. We're able to leverage that size 11 times so that we can improve the production capacity and therefore, make an impact on unit economics.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Caleb. I think that's a really great point, is to kind of define the use cases by the limitations of the container itself, and the unit economics is something that I think we're all really focused in on as the industry now, and how can we improve the operational capacity, the technology itself to make it a little bit, have a lower capex cost, and also to improve that the operational cost as well. And the premium side of things, I definitely think we're seeing a lot of that around in the mushroom game, microgreens, things like that. So I'm wondering, one, is your experience been the same as what Caleb's describing? Are a lot of your clients focused on, those premium products, or have you noticed that there's, some variety in the business models that they're working with?
Correct. No, I totally agree with Caleb's point of view, because we are at Verde Compacto. We are a container farm manufacturing and designing company, and from our experience, we've been working with multiple types of projects. Container farm usage, it's pretty wide. I will say it can be applied in many ways. But the most important thing or the key factor for having a successful application on the container farm operation is how profitable and how your return on investment looks like by knowing the region or the location where it will be installed. Also knowing what product are you gonna grow, and the final price of that product in the place where it's going to be sold to. And for example, we've seen multiple cases. For example, we've worked with universities, for example, that are using container farms for research and for training new capabilities on food oriented careers, for example. We've seen container farms being used for starting new businesses. For example, container farms are, let's say, it's an easier way to start a vertical farming operation, because you don't need to invest massive amounts of capital to start, and you can start scaling in a modular way your operations as your sales and operations starts to evolve. And we've also right now we've been working a lot now with more corporate oriented projects, with larger scale projects, like more B2B oriented projects with, for example, supermarkets in regions where the food supply it's kind of long, that it takes more than a day or two to the fresh products to arrive to the shelves. So we've seen also those type of projects emerging a lot, and more and other applications like impacting the consumer experience in consumption centers such as hotels, restaurants, even real estate development. So yeah, container farm, it has that characteristic, that it has a wide range of applications. But the most important thing there is how is the product going to be sold, at what price, or what's the benefit of using the container farm versus the capital needed to have an interesting payback on that. So I totally agree with Caleb's view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've made some good points, especially when it comes to, starting out in a vertical farm. You said that, oftentimes container farms are a really great way because they are a lower capex than going to, a huge warehouse facility where you're spending multi-millions in order to purchase, potentially the equipment to put into a large square footage, where container farms kind of have that entry point. It's manageable operations wise. It's more manageable to start off if you're new to the industry. So I think that's a really good point. And I think you and Caleb both touched on it, the unit economics, really understanding your market. Who is your end consumer of that product, and what can you actually sell that product for? I think that's one of the biggest key points in being able to decide whether or not a use case makes sense or not for container farms. So great. Thank you. Gabriel, in your role at Farm Anywhere, you're in a bit more of a unique position to, I think, talk about some more of the novel business ideas, because you're designing containers for, different types of cultivars, different types of businesses. So maybe you could share a little bit about some of the novel ideas that you've heard of or that you're working on recently.
Yeah, we've been working on a model that allows communities, either small or large communities, like we could say islands, all the way down to, let's say, a resort, to be able to service themselves with a delivery green. So our customers would come back with us with some feedback and say, hey, would we allow potential end users, potential consumers to go into the container and harvest the lettuce themselves. So that definitely brings a little bit of challenges when it comes to the biosecurity of the farm and so on and so forth. But however, there is the use case where you could have some sort of vending machine type environment that could be used for someone to be able to not necessarily access the farm itself, but on the outside have access to the food. So that's one quite novel way there that we've seen being worked on at the moment. Furthermore, when we go into the whole question of community service, seeing definitely a bit of a trend when it comes to having a hub, so a 40-foot container, for example, that's located into a city, and then you would have multiple 20-foot containers that would be more local for doing, for example, seedling stage to harvest stage. So extra hyper local, I guess we could call it, kind of farming. So hub model, a little bit like it is with flying on a plane, would be a good example of that. So those are kind of like the two main novel ones that we've been seeing in the last 3 to 6 months. Another thing too is converting existing buildings. So a lot of landlords are a little bit sketchy about putting vertical farms in their building. They're worried about humidity. They're worried about being able to convert a building, and then what happens if that vertical farm, for example, fails, especially with what we've seen in the last month. So instead of converting the entire building into a farm, then you would just stack a bunch of containers in a manner that makes sense inside a building. And be able to convert the building into a vertical farm, and then use also the advantages of farming in a container, which is small batches of multiple different cultivars or produce as well too. So it allows you to have a lot of variety as well, without having to build out a huge facility that requires permitting, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I think the diversification of crop selection is a key one, right? When we think about how quickly the markets can change, depending on who your end consumer is and who you're selling the product to. But diversifying a product is always a good idea. And with containers, you can start small and do that right from the beginning. If you have multiple containers, I know our farming as a service team is operating a facility in Montreal right now, and we're seeing the same thing. We're able to diversify each container just a little bit and also test to improve our our researching stage of the contract to see which nutrient solutions and all of these things make sense, and we're able to control for that across the board. So it's a really great way as well to be able to capitalize on your production and your output from a really early stage, because you can test different components in a container across the board. So those are all great points. Thanks so much. I just wanted to ask Juan if you would mind sharing what you think are the two greatest benefits to container farming. I know maybe it's a bit tricky to narrow them down to only two, but if you had to narrow them down, what would you say would be the two greatest benefits to container farming?
Well, yeah, it's a hard one because of course it depends a lot on again in every project how it's approached. But from our point of view, what we're seeing a lot of traction on that is, as Gabriel also was saying, on bringing increasing the hyper local concept, but in a more with higher yields than what we've seen with other vertical farming models, such as, for example, in-farms models. So container farming allows you to have that hyper-local concept of production. So let's say you can be growing outside the supermarket, on the roof of the supermarket, on the distribution of the supermarket, but not just for showcase. You can really grow to have enough supply to fulfill your shelves with and with produce that was harvested hours ago, right? So I think what container farmers are doing with the hyperlocal concept is getting a lot of weight right now, and a lot of, because what we were discussing, because you can grow modular, you can have different varieties of crops in the same facility, and it's easy. It's an easy way to scale and have a high yield in low space, basically anywhere in the world. So we've seen, for example, in supermarkets where the logistics, as I mentioned before, take over 2 to 3 days for the products to arrive. But the supermarket's value proposition is to have the best quality crops. There is it's where it's making a lot of sense, and sometimes in some type of products, even the cost of producing certain type of crops, it's lower than just buying the product, transporting the product, putting in the cold chain, and considering all the waste that it's generating. The overall cost is pretty competitive right now in this type of supermarket. So I would say the empowering the hyperlocal concept is one of the benefits on container farming. And other one, I would say, again, it's an easy way to start and scale vertical farming operations. Even though if you're a big corporation, again, like a supermarket or other type of business, it's an easy way to start a proof of concept and then scale it up, validate your metrics, and it's an easy way to scale it and replicate it in a very flexible way. You can scale it with the same concept of, as I was mentioning before, putting in the outside the stores, putting it in the distribution centers, but there's many ways to scale it up. So I would say that it's a very powerful way to start and validating and grow this type of farming operations.
Absolutely, and I think you're pointing to hyper locality of product now. I was reading a study last week that was talking about how in North America anyways, consumers are actually more concerned about buying local produce versus even organic product. So if you have that, within an hour away, it's just now grocery stores, restaurants are tuning into that the locality of their product is really important, and consumers are driving that, which is great to see. Instead of us having to push that into the market, we're seeing it driven from the market itself. So that's really interesting to see, and I think that container farms fill that gap so well, because you can put them virtually anywhere. So it's a great option for sure.
I don't know if you would let me add just one thing, one concept that we are seeing also based on this, what I said before, is that now, for example, the way of consuming this product also changes, and the way to market it also changes. But for the benefit also for the consumer, because we are seeing that in supermarkets where we're introducing this concept of hyperlocal, where packaging, for example, is taken away. So we're getting a better product, a fresh product with higher nutrition, and also a more eco-friendly product because there's no packaging needed. So it's transforming a little bit more on that concept, and where all of the food supply chain is also generating a change. So I think it's a win-win for the environment, consumer, and the retailer. So it's a circular solution.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Juan. Gabriel or Caleb, did you have anything to add around greatest benefits of container farming?
Gabe, I'll let you go first. I have a couple of things, but I'll let Gabe go first.
Sure. Go ahead, Gabriel. Oh, you're just muted, I believe. Sorry.
Thanks, Caleb, sorry. I would also add the fact that a lot of bylaws will restrict certain operations in urban sprawls, especially. And it seems like containers have the ability to sometimes kind of circumvent those bylaw restrictions, so to speak, especially because they're mobile, they're temporary structures. We at Farmera use pin and sleeve, so it's basically like a plug in the back of the container. So therefore, it's 100% unpluggable and movable within the hour if ever something were to happen. So that would be another benefit that containers allows us to do that we don't see in any other field, on top of the CapEx being so much lower.
Yeah, that's so true. especially when it comes down to the municipal restrictions that are often in cities, and when you're looking at Toronto, for example, just because that's close to where I am, they have so many restrictions with food production outside. It has to be in an industrial zoning, and if you have, if you want it to be super local in this downtown city of Toronto, you're not going to be able to access any buildings that would allow you to do that. So though just one example of the restrictions in that containers can really alleviate that. It's a really great point. Thanks for sharing that, Gabriel.
Yeah,
Caleb,
we just
go ahead. Oh, sorry, go
just
on.
do the farm first, build it first, and ask for forgiveness later when it comes to certain governmental agencies. If we have to wait all the time, we will never be able to feed everyone, right? So that's something to keep in mind for sure.
Very true. Thank you so much. Caleb, go ahead.
Well, Juan talked about access, and I think that's really important. And I just wanted to elaborate a couple of things on access. There's access from a capex perspective. Do I have the money to build a large vertical farm, or do I have enough to build a small containerized vertical farm? There's that type of access, and there's access by location. Maybe I'm in a dense urban environment, or I'm out in the middle of the desert, or I'm in a tundra type situation. A vertical farm gives me access inside of a container there that I otherwise would not have. And then finally, you have access from a resale opportunity. If you build a large vertical farm, you can't just pick it up and move it, or sell it to a new entity without them coming in and taking on whatever debts that may be burdened with, or whatever municipality restraints and other types of restraints that they may have. If I have a containerized farm, I can pick it up in the resale and move it to a new location for the new owner, which then gives me a different type of opportunity that I think is really important, which is new clients and new markets. So if I am, let's say I'm doing mushrooms in the Midwest, and I want to now try mushrooms in the New England area, I can take a container farm that I already have, move it to that area, and do a small production to prove the concept in the region, to start building the new clientele and establishing that relationship, and they can scale up as we go. So even though we talked earlier about unit economics being important, and the one-to-one relationship between the container and its production being limited, you can't just, every time you add a new container to expand your production, you still add new CapEx costs every time. Even though that's true, there's an advantage in that, which is you can start small, prove the concept, and then go up if you wanted to escape the container to a larger facility, or you can just stay in the container and have them in the discrete locations so your shipping costs are low, your time to consumption after harvest is short, and you're managing your operating costs. So I think those advantages are well worth the trade-offs.
Absolutely. And I think really where I'd like to talk now is about how do these benefits compare to other types of CEA? We talk about indoor vertical farming in a warehouse setting, for instance. What differentiates those benefits for container farms? Obviously, you can move them around versus warehouses. You've touched on that. But is there other comparables that you think really make container farming more, not necessarily more beneficial, but what differentiates that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. And just to clarify, I don't think large CEA or small CEA, either one is better. I think they're different, and so they have different applications.
Absolutely.
But I think a really nice advantage of a container is that you have a microclimate that you have to control. So one of the largest operating costs of large vertical or controlled environment agriculture is the cost to manage the climate, your temperature, your humidity, and then all your access points that can impact that. Those costs are typically pretty high on a daily and monthly and yearly basis. Inside of a container, you have a small environment. It's much more efficient to control that small environment than it is to control a large environment. Even stacking those containers gives you more production without any change really in the environmental expense. So you can expand with limited operating changes in the operating cost. So I think that's one advantage. Another advantage is you're controlling for contagion inside of a container. You don't have, you can only spoil, let's say you have a mold or fungus outbreak, or you have some type of bacterial issue. You can only spoil that one container size at a time. In large controlled environment ag, you can have things spread from one area to the next. which then, to mitigate those, increases your capital cost to put in mitigating controls and barriers and additional climate control options. So there's an advantage there, I think, as well. And then finally, I think there's a real advantage to the producer. In our situation, our clients are small to mid-sized livestock producers and large livestock producers. The small to mid-size use container farms to produce their livestock feed. And a real advantage for them is that there's a limited land consumption by a container farm. You can put it anywhere on the farm, right next to where your animals are, right next to your mixing facilities, right next to a really advantageous area. And you don't have to plan for a large build, a time-consuming process. And I think there's a real advantage there compared to large CEA. Large CEA, you need to plan years in advance almost. You have to get all your permits and regulations in order. You have to then lay the foundation and build the building, and you're waiting sometimes for supply chain to catch up to that. With a containerized farm, it's usually ready to go. They can bring it to you, drop it off, and you can begin producing almost immediately after purchase. And that, I think, is a really strong advantage for container farms versus large controlled environment ag.
Awesome. Thanks, Caleb. I think you make a really great point. It's not a matter of which is better, it's what's the use case. And I think that goes back to it, right? And we talked about that, the unit economics, the size, who you're supplying for. If a container may not, if you're looking to supply an entire market, a great, huge market, container farming maybe isn't going to be the right solution at the unit economic level. That's maybe where a larger scale warehouse facility might make more sense. But I think you made some great comparables about the flexibility and the location. I think for existing farmers, that is a really, really big benefit. So thanks so much for sharing that. Gabriel or Juan, did you have anything else you wanted to add around that, or shall we move to the next question?
Yeah, I would just add that, as you know, I'm a big believer that there is no such thing as one size fits all in any market whatsoever, right? So it is important for us as manufacturers and as providers of those solutions to really listen to customers and to really say, you know what, for what you're trying to do, containers may not be the main issue, but we know cultivated, for example, that will find a good solution for you that's based on your need. And just to be very upfront, the market's been tainted a little bit by different solutions being pushed down, certain farmers saying that, yeah, it'll work for you, that'll be great. And that kind of, is, I would say, very negative on everyone. So for us as manufacturers to really listen to the needs of our potential customers and say, yes, we can fill those needs, or no, container is not for you, is extremely important to maintain that all the time.
Absolutely. And I think when you actually oh, sorry, just getting some echo there. I think that listening to your clients and meeting them where they are in the process is so important. And I know that we work with you very closely, Gabriel, when we are scoping out a project for a client that container is a really viable option, depending on what their needs are and what they're looking to achieve. But oftentimes we do have to break that down to our clients and say, what you're looking to achieve is or the cultivar you're looking to grow maybe isn't the best option for that technology. Let's look at what else we can work with, or who else we can advise. Maybe we have a more automated system, or a warehouse is the right option for them. So I think that's a really great point, is there's no one size fits all, and we need to look at all of the different options that are available. Thanks so much. That actually leads us really into our next question that I have for you to start us off with, Gabriel. It's what type of buyer or farmer do you think is best suited for container farming? And so maybe, looking at the who isn't always the best way to put it, but I'm just trying to get inside the heads of a potential buyer, a potential farmer who's looking at container farming as an option. How would we determine whether or not they're the right person, or their product is the right thing for a container farm? What would you say to a potential farmer?
Yeah, especially we run into that on a weekly basis, where especially us, where we have quick turnaround time, right? So you put an order in, within 3 to 6 weeks, you get a farm out to you. which is a very good use case when it comes to shipping containers, is the ability to get to market quick. But with that comes a lot of new farmers that really has never farmed in their life, converting maybe from a corporate job into farming, or from a traditional agriculture into vertical indoor farming. And so they're great potential customers, but they don't necessarily have all the abilities right away to be able to operate the farm. So we kind of have to either do great training on our side. It's our responsibility as a manufacturer to train them so that they can use the equipment to the fullest of their ability. And on the back end, they make for great potential farmers because they're in it for a reason, right? If you're doing a corporate job and you're going into farming, it's because you want to feed people. You're in it for being able to have local produce a lot of times within your own community. So that's a great potential use case for potential operators of the farms as well too. So that's where it leads me to my next thing, is that sometimes it happens that we have corporate buyers that are behind large companies, but they don't necessarily have the people to be able to manage these farms, especially that they're relatively small scale if you compare it to other types of CA. And therefore, there is that marriage that can happen where a big corporation purchases the equipment and has the capex, but also has the offtake agreement, and then they can have operators to operate those farms. So we really have a really big spectrum here, right? So from mom and pop type operation all the way to big corporations, the use case is there, but the question always has to be asked: will the end user benefit the most from that type of operation? And where the farm goes to obviously makes a big difference for sure too.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Caleb or Juan, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'll add one a very, very important point. We've seen a lot of projects that slow down or don't make sense at all at the end of evaluating the opportunity because the client doesn't have a well defined the final use of the products. So, for example, if we've seen that projects can be deployed very faster and can make more sense financially when the consumer, let's say a hotel, restaurant, a farmer, a supermarket, university, whatever you call it, where they have well defined what's the end use of that product, because they can make some projections, they can make cost analysis, they can make they can ask with lower risk for financial opportunities. So and the other type of farmers or project we've seen is that people that are very interested in entering a vertical farming, but they don't really know how to sell the product to restaurants, to supermarket, or in the local farmers market. So they have to make all that analysis. There's a lot of risk. So I think that's a very important point, that there is a well-defined idea or potential on how to use the final products on the farm.
The offtake is, I think, one of the largest challenges we see our clients facing too. One of the many. Financing is also in there, I would say, but the offtake is a huge component. Not having a place for your product, it's going to lead to waste. It leads to a lot more stress in the situation as well. If you need to pay off a loan or something like that, and you don't have anywhere for your product to go, having a secure offtake is really, really important. Try to convey that as well. So I think that's a really great point, and it's interesting to hear that there's more of these corporate entities like supermarket chains or things like that, where the main consumer of those who are going to be off taking those products anyways are interested in cutting back their supply chain. I think that makes a lot of sense, that we'll see more of that headed in that direction. So thanks so much for that one. Caleb, did you want to add anything? I know the farmers you deal with are often traditional farmers, so maybe you have a different perspective on who makes good, or who container farming is most appropriate for.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to counter what Gabe and Juan said. I think they're spot on. I would add, though, that there's often too much of a myopic view in container farming around the actual cost. We think of the container as the cost, the electricity or the fuel that it consumes, and the location where it's sitting, and if we have to rent that location or not. But if you think about what Juan said about having a really good problem definition, and then having strong offtake relationships, so that you know where that product's going, there's a clear vision for who's going to consume it. You already have that relationship. There's another piece there that Gabe also alluded to, that is required by the owner of the vertical farm to absorb, and that is risk. So if I have a container farm and I'm producing X pounds of strawberries or mushrooms or livestock feed, and my container farm goes down for reasons that I cannot control, like we lose electricity in the neighborhood, or water gets cut off, or there's an environmental event, our clients that are paying for the offtake, they're managing the product at the end, they can't get it. And so there's costs that go into not bulletproofing, but reinforcing your production capacity, whether it be solar or battery backups, or even a second container farm, so that if one goes down, your other can keep performing. There's some real cost and nuance there that needs to be understood. Our producers, our clients are livestock producers. They're not usually the strongest economic players in the market. Not because they're not good at it, but because the economics for livestock production are low margin by and large. And so it's a fragile system that if I come in and I produce a wonderful container farm that does everything they need, but it's risky and it's fragile and it's reliability, because I have electrical needs, I have water needs, and I can't control all the other environmental factors that may impact it, I'm not really helping the farmer. So I have to build in and take and absorb the cost of producing a more reliable product that has backups and mitigation plans for when power goes down or water goes down, or if there's other environmental events. Because the last thing that we need in vertical farming is for clients to become dependent upon it and it to not be dependable. And then your restaurant was not going to source your mushrooms anymore. And then the next vertical farm that comes along, let's say that they've solved all these problems, they have a larger hurdle to jump over because the previous vertical farm did it wrong, or didn't think through all of the mitigation strategies. And so now we have a bigger hurdle. And we're starting to see that as some of these large CEA operations fail because they didn't manage their operating costs properly. It then casts a shadow across all of vertical farming, whether it's in a container or in a large unit. And I think there's a real play there where leveraging the right technology, but also the right philosophical approach allows us to be a stronger partner for our offtake agreements. We need to have mitigation strategies. We need to be able to provide a backup plan if things don't go well.
I think that's such an admirable approach as a technology provider and manufacturer to keep that in mind for your clients, because you're absolutely right. We've seen in the past several months many vertical farms in Europe, for instance, who've had to close their doors because they did not forecast, the potential risk associated with increasing their energy costs by X amount. So, that is a small variable that can be detrimental to a lot of facilities. So I think that you, as the technology provider, thinking these through and wanting to mitigate those risks for the producer makes it, us as an industry, more focused on that approach, and we should be very much so thinking about the long-term benefits for the end consumer, and for the clients themselves. So I think that's a really great approach. Thanks for sharing that, Kyla. Juan or Gabriel, did you have anything else to add to that? I know we're just coming up. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got one more question to get through, and then I think we'll hand.
Well, I think the only thing just complementing Caleb's point of view, many people think that when buying a container farm, when they just connect it to power and to water, they suddenly will be growing everything and everything is going to work perfectly, and I think that's an expectation that needs to be covered by the technological supplier, because we've seen that normally the learning process of a new farmer into vertical farming can take from 4 to 12 months. So, for example, how we are helping our farmers is that we are 12 for the initial 12 months. We are very close support with them remotely, via Wi-Fi. We can access their farms, and we can be their backup. For example, we offer them the right administrative formats and sheets, documents, so they can put all their costs, the real costs, the real projections, etc., to help them out. But I think a very important thing there is because I think that that's an idea that many people think that when I get my farm, I plug it in, and tomorrow I'll be harvesting. I think that's a wrong idea. Even though it's much faster than traditional farming to get your product deployed and grown, but of course there's a learning process. There's a put it to a point kind of timing that you need to consider. So that's important for the technological supplier to be backing them up with everything they need.
For sure, it is still a farm, right? There's a lot of components that I think sometimes, yeah, you're right. The idea that it's an appliance, it's plug and play. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think the more honest we are about that situation, and we try to be very upfront and ask our clients questions that if they have thought about these things before they actually purchase a farm or things like that, to make sure that they are ready and understand what's actually involved in that, in managing a farm, getting the farm up and running and started. So yeah, that's very, very true. I think that leads us well into our next question. And Juan, and I did want to start off with you on this, around the economics of container farming. I think that's really sometimes what it comes down to, is what is the profitable business model of container farming. So from your perspective, what is the business case for container farms with economics in mind? Do you have a general idea of, timelines for ROI? I think, return on investment is obviously a key component of that. So wondering if you could share a bit about that.
Sorry. Of course, it's very variable depending on what you're growing and the price are you going to sell to and what's your distribution channel. It's pretty variable. I would say we've seen normally for us to have an interesting or a viable project to sell. Normally, we've seen ROIs that go to 2 years to 3.5 or 3 years and a half on ROIs. In other cases, they can go up to 5 years, but of course, as I said, it's feasible for this type of projects because they are having other type of benefits that helps their complements their actual business or their actual value proposition. But normally, I would say it can go from 2 to 3.5 years once you get your farm. Also, that's why, as Gabriel was saying, the time on you getting your farm to your installed into your place is key because those months count in your payback time. So that's key, and that's something that we are also working on that. For example, we are getting projects from 3 to 4 months deployed on anywhere in the world, from Mexico to anywhere in the world. We have pretty nice access and pretty well communicated routes to the US, Canada, Asia, and Europe. But yeah, I think that's a very important thing to consider as well in your payback times, the installation and that waiting time until you get your farm in your place. But yeah, that's normally what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's been a big takeaway for me from this conversation, is just getting to growing faster. Container farming seems like an incredibly viable option to really get started, prove your concept, potentially scale up or understand your market a little bit better, and also gives you the flexibility to pivot or to add on containers and do something different as well if there is room for growth there. So thanks so much, Juan. Caleb or Gabriel, did you want to add anything around economics, business case for container farming?
Yeah, I would definitely add that for us, anyways, at Farming, we have a bit of a different mindset when it comes to ROI when customers ask that. If a farmer is going to be operating a farm, it's important for him to understand his own economics and to understand his own input and output. So therefore, we always stay away from giving them actual like year count or this farm will produce 100 and something thousand per year, right? Instead, we could definitely do it, but instead, because of the different inputs of like what seeds you have access to, what climates you're in, what your power are, what your rent is, all that is so varies across the planet. We have a different approach where we say, look, this is how many sites plant size there is, or this is how much square foot you have for your mushroom production, for example, or for your microgreens. Give them the operational math behind it and let them come to their own conclusion when it comes to what their ROI should be for their own environment. So it's simple for any farmer really to just, go on Google, put P&L sheet and start building up their own financial models, and then reach out to the help of like Cultivated, for example, to help validate those numbers. And therefore it allows us to be extremely honest to the farmer as to what the ROI should be for their farms. And it allows them to really understand the business case behind it as well too, because farming is not just I'm putting seeds in rock wool and I'm putting into a raft, right? There's accounting behind it, there's HR behind it, there's a lot of manual skills. When things go wrong, of course we build redundancies in the container so that the farmer is not left stuck. But at the end of the day, things do go wrong, and that farmer needs to be able to lift up their sleeves and be able to do some plumbing or some electrical. So all that combined together, I got a little off subject on the whole what the farmer's ability are, but going back towards the ROI there, helping them get to their own conclusion on that based on the rent is definitely a big thing. And also just giving them a little bit of confidence as well too. If you're going to do farm, like a container farm, and you're going to do it in an urban sprawl, I bet you could drive in any city, New York, LA, and find an empty lot somewhere. The empty lot is for a reason, right? So that person that owns that empty lot, what's them to get a little bit of revenue per month for an empty lot that's not doing anything and put a farm on it. It's a good way to be able to reduce one of their biggest input costs, which is rent. So being able to negotiate kind of a really cheap rent and being able to be in the middle of an urban sprawl, that's a big advantage that has to be leveraged. And then your second input obviously is labor. So, on the islands, for example, we have projects in the Caribbean. Labor is quite affordable, but if we were to do something in Vancouver here, it'd be a different story. So being able to show the farmer, this is how you search for labor costs, this is how you input it, and this is how many hours you should be looking at it per site, really helps them to understand that, well, okay, this is more than just having a garden in your backyard there.
Right. The reality of all of the costs associated with is really, really important because that will impact your ROI. So I think it's great that you are able to counsel your clients into understanding those things, how to think about them, how to research a lot of it. Coming into a new business in agriculture, in food production, and in a small setting like a container, sometimes clients don't necessarily know where to start with those things to model them out. So I think that's really great that you're putting some of the onus back on them to understand that, because at the end of the day, it is their business and they're going to be accountable to be able to, make sure they're meeting their outputs that the container is capable of. Even, that's one of the biggest things is sometimes takes a little bit longer to reach the outputs because you have to test and trial all of these things. And we see some clients who don't necessarily budget for that time. So those things are really important to keep in mind, along with the labor costs and where you're located and all of these ideas. So that's great. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Caleb, would you like to add anything on that before we move on to our Q&A? You're just muted. Sorry. I believe you're good now. Sorry. It's not working now. Not sure why Chris is there. Chris on the back end. Are you able to take control of his mic and try to adjust that? Some troubleshooting here. Sorry, Caleb. Very weird that that's not working. I apologize. I'm just going to have you and Chris chat on the backstage chat, if that's okay, and we'll move into Q&A, and we'll come back as long as we get your mic out. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, we do have a couple of questions in the chat here, so we're going to move into our Q&A. We only have about 10 minutes left, and hopefully we can get Caleb's mic sorted so that he can contribute to the Q&A as well. But one of the first questions we have from the audience is, what is the most sustainable and profitable crops for container farming? You know, that one might be also difficult. Sometimes there's lots of nuances. But Gabriel or Juan, do you want to give that a go?
Well, from our experience, again, as Gabriel was saying as well, there's not a right answer on that because it depends a lot on what's the most scarce product in your region, what's the sales price on your region. For example, we've seen here in some parts of the U.S. and Mexico, where, for example, kale in certain regions is not very interesting or very profitable to grow because you can get it from traditional farming as well, and there's a lot of offer in the market out there. But we've seen in other, for example, in the northwest side of Mexico, with kale, is the price is like 2 or 3 times higher than in the center of the country. So there it makes a lot of sense to grow kale. So there's not a right answer on that. It depends a lot on the specific locality opportunities on prices, and that's the whole point, because virtually you can grow any type of crop in a container farm, but again, everything needs to be designed, and you need to take the right decisions, understanding what the market needs and opportunities out there. That's on one side. On the other side, of course, what the crops that we've seen that are more popular because normally they get to premium prices, etc. Of course, the microgreens, it's also very interesting. But now it comes to demand type of thing, that if the microgreen prices are pretty interesting, but maybe the volume that I can grow in my container, it's way too much that I can deploy. So I think that's one thing. Also, we've seen a lot of on the mushroom containers. There's a lot of growth on those type of crops, because there are really interesting market prices in the U.S., for example. But those same mushrooms in Mexico aren't that expensive as in the U.S. So here in Mexico, it doesn't make a lot of sense to grow those types of mushrooms. So it's pretty variable. I think you need to understand the needs on your region, and the prices on the premium side of your products, and there evaluate what within the possibilities to grow, what are the best choices on your crops.
Absolutely, and to the sustainability side of things too, I think it's always a tricky one, because mushrooms, for instance, use less light. They don't require nutrients, so the aspects of what you're putting into a container versus strawberries, for instance. If you're to do strawberries in a container farm, there's going to be drastic difference in energy consumption. But when you compare strawberry production in a container versus traditional egg, maybe there is more aspects of sustainability. So there's so many aspects of it. I think that sustainability is a trickier one, and it really depends on what aspect of sustainability you're really trying to target in on. So hopefully that helps our audience member a little bit more, but gives you some ideas to think about. The next question. Sorry.
Add an extra as well too. Before selecting an equipment, I would encourage the farmers to just go out in the community that you will be producing for, and don't be scared to ask for the manager, ask for the farmers market, visit the farmers market, and just say, hey, what's your pain point? What are you looking for? Oh, we're looking for kale. We can't get any kale. I know basil is a difficult one in winter in Canada. So by all means, you need to be able to pivot, summer crop, winter crop, and just ask and have a notepad and say, okay, one crop that came back was basil, strawberries, and then you start doing your research as to which of those crops will make sense for what availability you have as well in terms of land and budget. And to be able to determine that, most countries have tools to be able to determine that. So in Canada, we have an agency that tracks the pricing when it comes to produce bi-weekly. So you could just look it up, say what's strawberries priced like at the wholesale market last week. And it's called Statistic Canada, and you could follow that. And I know the US has something very similar. And then there's also a website called Tridge. It does the same thing as well too. You can just put in your produce and kind of get a scale. And therefore, you got some really easy tools by opening up conversation with your community, but also being able to quickly iterate and see what the prices are. And the prices that you see as well too at the farmers market and on the shelves, if you remove 30%, you would probably find out very close to what the wholesale price is. So that's a good way as well to be able to determine what your revenue would look like at a glance before you start getting into the nitty gritty of buying equipment and figure out where to put the lens.
That's great. Thank you for sharing those resources too. I think that's really helpful and valuable for the audience, Gabriel. Thanks so much. We had another question around estimated cost for container farm. I think this one's also tricky sometimes because it really depends on what you're growing, what needs to be retrofitted. I'm sure Gabe, you would agree with, when you're designing that there's a big, it depends kind of question that goes into determining cost of a container. But Gabriel or Juan, do either of you did you want to throw, an approximate out there just to give our audience a sense of what maybe the cost would be?
Yeah, well, our model in a very compact is that we have a standardized version of a container farm that we call the Hubster that has 286 growing towers and everything, all the nutrient control, environment control, etc. But we call it like a standard. This is our standard model, and that standard model starts at 115,000 US dollars. Of course, there are leasing opportunities and other type of mechanisms to make it accessible for you. But again, that's the starting point. Of course, in every project, we'd like to work very closely with our clients to understand what they're needing, where the farm location would be, where are they going to grow, what their business model is going to look like. Because within all of those requirements and project needs from the standard model, we can make certain adjustments to ensure that the right design and the right solution is done to meet those needs. It can go for example, in certain we have a project that we are building in the Yukon. So that's extremely cold conditions. So there you have to take extra caution in certain type of equipment, etc. So you need to make certain adjustments on that. For example, we're working on the projects where we're putting many container farms integrated as a single farm. So there we are built. For example, we are taking away the germination side on our containers and increasing the production capacity and putting the germination in a separate container and everything integrated in a packaging and working area. So that's a starting point in our side. And again, depending on your project and depending on the needs of every client, we take it from there.
Mm-hmm. For us on our side, we got a container called the Universal Light Farm. So it's a container that has all the basic requirements that you need. So the HVAC, most electrical needs as well too, an irrigation skid, a lobby at the front to be able to separate your grow room from the outside environment. And in there's all the controllers. And then you could just outfit it with your own equipment as well too. So that starts at 89,000 US, and it's really, that's the most basic solution you could go in. It's very good for existing farmers that want to outfit existing equipment in it or be able to kind of build off of that. And then that's the base that we use for everything else. So over the years, I saw kind of like a pattern of what needed to be on a basic setup. So that Universal Light Farm has all the basic setup, and then we build off that. So let's say, for example, you wanted to do NEBB and Flow NFT type racking system, we will outfit it for you and ship it out. So the basic is always there to be able to not only scale, but pivot whenever things changes and also go with your budget, right? Because obviously that's your probably the biggest decision maker. But the ability to have that in terms of speed to get to market, since Universal Light Farms, we have them in stock right now. So it allows the farmers to really be able to get the container up and running and kind of figure out what the market looks like. That's the solution to go for sure.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think we lost Caleb, so I apologize to Caleb for that, and to the audience for missing out on his comments there at the end. But we're actually at 2 o'clock. I feel like we maybe should have made this a little longer, but we've got some great questions in the chat. So I'll take some time here after to send out the questions to our panelists so they can all comment, and then I'll throw them back here in the chat. This stays open, and the recording will be posted here after as well. So we'll get back to you on the questions that were not answered during the Q&A. I apologize, but thank you all for participating and for the questions. Panelists, thank you so much, Juan and Gabriel and Caleb, for tuning in today and for sharing your insights. It's been really, really valuable to me, and I hope it was to you as well and to our audience. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Erica. Goodbye. Have a nice week.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Bye.